Welcome back to the deep dive. We are doing something a little different today. Usually we talk about systems or economies or tech things that are, abstract. But today we are talking about an engine, a physical mechanical engine that is running right now inside your chest, hopefully without you even noticing it.
And not just any engine. We are looking at what is arguably the most efficient, durable, and frankly miraculous mechanical device in the known universe. We're talking about the heart.
I was reading through the source material for this, specifically Robbins and Cochrane pathologic basis of disease and Underwood's pathology, and I tried to really contextualize the numbers. We say the heart, and people think of the Valentine shape or they think of a generic pump, but looking at the physics of it, it's terrifying.
It's relentless. That is the word that comes to mind when you study cardiac pathology. Relentless.
Right. I did the back-of-the-napkin math on the stats provided in the intro to Robbins' chapter. If you live an average life, this thing beats something like 2.5 to 3 billion times. It never stops for maintenance. It never shuts down for an oil change. If you built a mechanical pump out of titanium and steel and ran it at that cadence, 40 million times a year?
About that, yeah.
How long would it last?
Maybe a few years, maybe a decade if you were lucky and had great engineering. And yet, biological tissue meat essentially does it for 80 years. It repairs itself while running.
And it's not just sitting there beating, it is moving fluid, 7,500 liters a day.
A day.
That is a tanker truck of liquid, moved by a piece of muscle the size of your fist, every single day.
It really puts the work in workload. And Robbins points out something fascinating about the development timeline. The cardiovascular system is the first fully functional organ system in utero. We are talking 8 weeks gestation.
8 weeks?
Before the brain is fully online, before the lungs are doing anything useful, the heart is there driving the entire developmental process.
Because without it, nothing else grows. Fetal demise is inevitable without that flow. But, and here is the heavy part, the reason we are doing this specific deep dive, because it is so central. When it fails, the consequences are catastrophic.
Exactly. We're looking at the #1 cause of mortality worldwide.
Yeah.
In the United States alone, cardiovascular disease accounts for roughly 700,000 deaths a year. That is a staggering number.
It just eclipses everything else, cancer, accidents.
It's the ceiling on human longevity. For most of us, this is the system that will eventually fail.
So the stakes are literally life and death. Now, we have a stack of heavy reading today. We're synthesizing Robbins, which is basically the Bible of pathology and Underwood. These are dense texts. They are thick, heavy books.
They are. And they can be dry if you don't know what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Our job today isn't to read you the textbook. It's to build a mental scaffold. We want to move you away from thinking of the heart as a static pump, like a water pump in your basement, and start seeing it as a responsive, dynamic organ.
That was the biggest takeaway for me. The heart isn't just a machine you install. It's a machine that upgrades and downgrades itself depending on what you do to it. It's constantly listening to the body's demands.
And that's our theme: adaptation and failure. The heart works until it can't. Disease is just what happens when the adaptation mechanisms we're about to discuss get overwhelmed.
So to keep us organized, we're going to use a framework from Robbins. Instead of just listing 1,000 random diseases, we're going to look at the broken heart mechanisms. Basically, there are 6 ways this machine breaks.
Right. If you strip away the fancy Latin names, the heart can fail in 6 specific mechanical ways.
Okay, lay them out for us. Number 1.
Pump failure.
Yeah.
Simple as that. The muscle is either too weak to squeeze or it's too stiff to relax and fill.
Right, so a power problem or a filling problem. Number 2.
Obstruction to flow. Imagine a door that won't open. The pressure builds up behind it. That's a stenosis.
Okay, number 3.
Regurgitant flow. The door opens, but it won't close all the way. So the blood you just pumped flows backward.
A leaky valve. Number 4.
Shunted flow. Blood goes the wrong way, usually through a hole that shouldn't be there, bypassing the lungs of the body.
A plumbing mistake. Number 5.
Conduction disorders. The electrical grid fails. The timing is off. You lose synchrony. It's like an orchestra without a conductor.
And finally, number 6.
Rupture. The vessel or the heart wall physically breaks. Catastrophic structural failure. The engine block cracks.
That's it. If you keep those 6 mechanisms in mind, everything else we discuss, from heart attacks to genetic defects, is just a variation on one of those themes.
Precisely. It's a limited repertoire of failure for an infinite variety of insults.
Okay, so let's get into that first big concept you mentioned, adaptation. You said the heart remodels. If I go to the gym and lift weights, my biceps get bigger. Is that what the heart is doing?
In a sense, yes. But the heart is smarter than your biceps. It responds to specific types of stress in very specific architectural ways. And this is where we really need to distinguish between the two ways the heart gets big. We need to talk about hypertrophy versus dilation.
Okay, I see these terms used interchangeably in news articles, but you're saying mechanically they're opposites.
Completely different. And to understand this, you have to think about the geometry of the stress. Let's take scenario A. You have high blood pressure, systemic hypertension, or maybe you have aortic stenosis, where the valve leading out of the heart is tight and calcified.
Okay, so the pipes are tight, the heart has to push harder to open the door and get the blood out.
Exactly. It's a pressure overload. The heart is squeezing against a closed valve or high resistance. Now imagine the wall of the heart. If you are a single muscle cell, a cardiomyocyte, and you are under immense tension, you need to share the load.
So you need more muscle fibers. You need to reinforce the wall.
You need thickness. Mechanics tells us, specifically the law of Laplace, that wall stress is inversely proportional to wall thickness. So if you make the wall thicker, the stress on any individual fiber goes down. The cell decides to build new contractile units.
These are the sarcomeres, the little protein engines.
The sarcomeres. But here's the critical detail Robbins focuses on. In pressure overload, the cell stacks these new sarcomeres in parallel.
Like stacking bricks side by side to thicken a wall.
Perfect analogy. You aren't making the room bigger, you are making the walls thicker. This is concentric hypertrophy. The wall gets massive, but the chamber inside the room stays the same size or even gets smaller because the wall is encroaching inward.
Okay, so that's the bodybuilder heart. Thick, strong, pressure resistant. But what about scenario B? What if the problem isn't pressure, but volume?
Right, a totally different mechanical problem. Let's say you have an aortic valve that leaks. Every time you pump blood out, half of it falls back in. Or you have a hole in the septum between the ventricles.
So the heart is constantly overfilled.
It's drowning. It's a volume overload. Now, thickening the wall doesn't help you hold more water.
No, you need a bigger bucket.
You need a bigger bucket. The cells sense this constant stretch, and they build new sarcomeres again. But this time, they stack them in series.
End to end, like extending a telescope or adding links to a chain.
Yes. They literally make the muscle fibers longer. And what does that do to the chamber?
It makes it bigger. It dilates it.
It dilates it. The wall thickness might look normal or even thin relative to the giant chamber, but the heart itself is huge. It's a balloon. This is dilation, or eccentric hypertrophy.
Okay, so just to recap. Pressure equals parallel stacking, which makes a thick wall. Volume equals series stacking, which makes a wide chamber.
That's the core concept of cardiac remodeling.
It sounds like a brilliant adaptation. The heart is solving the problem. It's engineering a solution. So why is this in a pathology textbook? Where does it go wrong?
Because there is no such thing as a free lunch, physiologically speaking. This adaptation is a Faustian bargain.
I love that phrase. A deal with the devil. What's the cost?
The cost is vasculature. You are building all this expensive, hungry muscle.
But you aren't building new blood vessels to feed it.
You got it. The capillary density does not increase proportionally to the muscle mass. Robbins calls this the beefy heart. It looks strong, but it is oxygen-starved. It's ischemic even at rest.
So you've built a mansion, but you've only got the plumbing for a studio apartment.
Exactly. And the second problem, especially with that thick concentric heart, is stiffness. That thick hypertrophied muscle doesn't relax well. It's hard to fill. The muscle gets fibrotic, scarred. And eventually, the adaptive mechanisms like the Frank-Starling law, where stretch equals force, or the neurohumoral activation like the renin-angiotensin system, they stop working.
They burn out.
They burn out. They become maladaptive. The RAAS system starts causing more fibrosis and water retention. And that is the tipping point. That is the transition from compensated hypertrophy, where the patient feels fine, to decompensated heart failure.
And when we talk about failure, we usually split it into two buckets, systolic and diastolic. I always found this a bit confusing in med school because it felt like semantic splitting, but clinically it's huge.
It dictates the entire treatment strategy. Think of the cardiac cycle. Systole is the squeeze, diastole is the fill.
Simple enough. So what's systolic dysfunction?
That's a pumping problem. The heart is too weak to eject the blood. The ejection fraction, the percentage of blood that leaves the ventricle with each beat, drops. A normal EF is, say, 55 to 65%. In systolic failure, it could drop below 40, even below 20%.
This is usually what happens after a heart attack, right? The muscle is dead or the chamber is so dilated, so baggy, it can't squeeze effectively.
Correct. Ischemia or dilation, like we see in dilated cardiomyopathy, usually leads to systolic failure. It's a failure of contractility.
Okay, so what about diastolic dysfunction?
This is different. This is often called heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, or HFpEF.
Because the pump can still squeeze.
It squeezes fine. Sometimes it squeezes too well. The EF is normal. The problem is the pump is too stiff. It can't relax to let the blood in. It's a filling problem. If you can't fill the chamber, you can't pump much blood out, even if your squeeze is strong.
This is what we see with that thick hypertrophied heart we just talked about.
Yes. Or with fibrosis or amyloid deposition, where protein gunk stiffens the wall. It's a failure of compliance. So systolic is can't squeeze, diastolic is can't fill.
That's a great way to put it. All right, that brings us to the villain of the story. The absolute giant of pathology, ischemic heart disease.
This is the dominant pathology. In the industrialized world, this is what kills us.
And fundamentally, this is that supply and demand problem you mentioned.
It is an accountant's nightmare. The myocardium has a massive metabolic demand. It uses huge amounts of ATP to keep beating. It's an oxygen hog.
Yeah.
And the coronary arteries provide the perfusion supply. If demand exceeds supply, you get ischemia.
And 90% of the time, the reason supply is low is atherosclerosis.
Coronary artery disease.
Yeah.
But we need to be careful not to think of this as just a static clogged pipe. Robbins emphasizes that the plaque is dynamic. It's not just about how narrow the hole is, it's about the stability of the plaque.
Right. So you can have stable angina, where you have a fixed stenosis, say, greater than 70% occlusion. The plaque is old, fibrotic, calcified.
It's stable.
Ah.
So you only get pain angina when you exert yourself. You run for the bus, demand goes up, and you hit that supply ceiling. You rest, demand goes down, pain goes away.
But then you have unstable angina.
That's the danger zone. This is the harbinger of a heart attack. This is where the plaque disrupts, it ruptures or erodes, and a thrombus, a clot, starts to form on top of it. It's an active dynamic process. Now you have pain at rest.
And if that clot completely blocks the vessel, we're in myocardial infarction territory.
The heart attack, and here is where the timeline becomes absolutely critical. We call this the wavefront of death.
That sounds incredibly dramatic.
It is dramatic, and it's a race against the clock. Let's walk through the minutes, because this is what dictates whether a patient lives or dies in the ER.
Okay, clock starts now. You have a total occlusion. Blood flow stops.
Within seconds, aerobic metabolism fails. The cell runs out of oxygen. It switches to anaerobic glycolysis.
Which isn't efficient. You don't get much ATP out of that.
It's terrible. It produces lactic acid. The cell becomes acidic. ATP is depleted rapidly. Within 2 minutes, just 2 minutes, loss of contractility occurs. The heart muscle stops beating in that area.
But is it dead yet?
Not yet. This is the reversible window. The engine has stalled, but the parts aren't broken. If you restore flow here, the tissue survives. But the clock is ticking. You have about 20 to 40 minutes.
That's the threshold.
That is the threshold. Once you cross 20 to 40 minutes of severe ischemia, irreversible damage begins. Coagulative necrosis. The cells die.
And this is where that wavefront concept from Underwood comes in. The death doesn't happen everywhere at once. It spreads.
No. It starts in the subendocardium. That's the inner layer of the heart muscle right up against the chamber.
Why there? Why not the outside?
Because of the plumbing. The coronary arteries sit on the outside surface, the epicardium. They send perforating branches diving down into the muscle. The subendocardium is at the very end of the line. It's the last house on the cul-de-sac.
So when the water pressure drops, the last house loses water first.
Exactly. Plus, the pressure inside the ventricle during systole physically squeezes those deep vessels, making it even harder for blood to get there. So necrosis starts inside and spreads outward to the epicardium over about 6 to 12 hours.
This is why we say time is myocardium. If you can get a patient to the cath lab and open that artery in hour 1, you might just have a small subendocardial infarct. You save the outer wall.
But if you wait 12 hours, it's a transmural infarct. The whole wall is dead. And that distinction matters. A subendocardial infarct might just cause some dysfunction. A transmural infarct creates a patch of dead leather that can rupture.
Okay, let's visualize this. I love the way Robbins describes the morphology of an MI over time. It's like a visual timeline of decay and repair. If I'm a pathologist looking at this heart, what am I seeing?
Let's go chronologically. 0 to 12 hours.
Yeah.
If I look at the heart grossly with my naked eye.
You might see nothing. Maybe a little modeling. It can look completely normal.
Right. It can be very subtle. But microscopically, this is where you look for the wavy fibers.
I found this image really striking. Explain the mechanics here. Why are they wavy?
It makes perfect physical sense. You have a patch of dead fibers that can't squeeze. They're flaccid. But the living fibers right next to them are still pulling and pounding away with every beat, so the dead fibers get stretched, buckled, and distorted by the motion of their neighbors. They look like wavy noodles.
That's such a visceral sign of localized failure. It's the first hint of trouble.
It is. You also see the beginnings of coagulative necrosis. The cell outlines are there, but the nuclei are disappearing. They look like ghost cells.
Okay, now let's move to 12 to 24 hours.
Now you can see it grossly. The tissue starts to look darker, mottled, congested. Microscopically, the changes are obvious. The nuclei shrink and become dark little dots, that's penosis, and the cytoplasm gets incredibly pink hypereosinophilia. The cell has shut down its machinery. It's becoming a tombstone.
Then, days 1 to 3. This is when the cavalry arrives.
The immune system wakes up. This is the peak of acute inflammation. Neutrophils swarm the area. They're there to attack the dead tissue and break it down. You'll see a yellow-tan, soft center developing.
It's basically forming an abscess of dead heart.
In a way, yes, it's an inflammatory soup.
Yeah.
And then days 3 to 7. This seems like the most critical window for complications. It is the most dangerous window. The neutrophils die off, and macrophages, the big eaters, move in to clean up the mess. They are phagocytosing, just eating the dead muscle to clear the site for a scar.
So wait, you have dead muscle being eaten away, effectively dissolving the structure, but you haven't built the new scar tissue yet.
Precisely. You've removed the structural steel, but you haven't poured the concrete. The wall is at its absolute softest and weakest point right here. Day 3 to 7. This is when rupture happens.
We'll come back to rupture in a second. So after day 7, things start to get better.
They start to heal. Days 7 to 10, granulation tissue appears at the margins. This is the healing scaffold. New blood vessels, loose collagen, fibroblasts. You'll see a red, hyperemic border around the yellow infarct.
And finally, weeks to months.
A dense fibrous scar. White, tough, type I collagen. And this is a crucial point that Robbins hits hard. The heart does not regenerate.
Underwood mentions there are some stem cells, right? Some limited capacity.
There are some, but functionally, for a massive infarct, they are irrelevant. The heart patches. It scars. It does not grow new muscle.
So you're left with a permanent patch of non-contractile tissue, a patch of leather in a muscular balloon.
Which brings its own set of long-term problems. But before we get to the complications, we have to talk about the paradox of reperfusion.
Ah, yes, the cruel irony of cardiology. We said, time is myocardium, we want to open the artery. But sometimes restoring flow actually hurts the cells.
It does. It's called reperfusion injury. Imagine a cell that has been starving. Its ion pumps are broken, the membrane is damaged, it's barely holding on. Suddenly, you flush it with high-pressure, oxygen-rich blood.
Which sounds good, but it's full of calcium.
Full of calcium. And because the cell can't regulate its internal environment anymore, that calcium floods inside. Now, what does calcium do to muscle?
It makes it contract.
Right, so the sarcomeres, the muscle fibers, clamp shut. But because the mitochondria are damaged, they don't have the ATP to relax. They get stuck in a state of tetanic contraction.
The rigor mortis of the living cell.
Exactly. Microscopically, you see contraction bands, dark pink bands across the cell. It's a sign that the cell died while being rescued. It clamps shut and tore itself apart. You also get a flood of free radicals from the oxygen, which causes more damage.
That is tragic. And there's also stunned myocardium, right?
Yes. That's tissue that isn't dead, but it's so metabolically battered by the ischemia and the reperfusion that it just stops contracting for a few days. It needs a nap before it wakes up and comes back online.
Okay, so let's move to section 3, the complications. We mentioned that day 3 to 7 danger zone, the mechanical failures.
These are the catastrophic structural failures. The tissue is soft, the macrophages are eating it, and the pressure inside the heart is still at 120/80. Something has to give.
Rupture.
Rupture.
Yeah.
And it can happen in 3 specific places, each creating a different disaster. First, the free wall of the left ventricle.
If that breaks, blood pours out of the heart
into the pericardial sac.
Yeah.
That's hemopericardium. The sac is tough. It's made of fibrous tissue, doesn't stretch easily, so it fills up, compresses the heart, and you get cardiac tamponade. The heart physically cannot fill because it's being squeezed from the outside.
It's fatal without immediate intervention.
It's rapidly fatal without a needle to drain it, right there in the ER.
Okay, second place for a rupture, the septum.
The wall between the left and right ventricle. If that breaks, you get an acute ventricular septal defect, VSD.
So the left ventricle, which is high pressure, pumps oxygenated blood straight into the right ventricle.
Exactly. A massive left-to-right shunt. You overload the lungs instantly. The patient goes into acute right heart failure and cardiogenic shock.
And third, the smallest but deadliest rupture, The papillary muscle.
These are the little muscles inside the ventricle that hold the mitral valve closed like guy wires on a parachute. The posteromedial one is particularly vulnerable because it only has one blood supply. If that supply is cut,
The wire snaps.
the wire snaps. The valve flails open. You get acute, severe mitral regurgitation. The lungs get flooded with blood instantly. That's fulminant pulmonary edema.
These are terrifying scenarios. But what about when the wall doesn't break, but it just thins out and bulges?
That's an aneurysm.
Yeah.
And we need to distinguish between a true aneurysm and a pseudoaneurysm. This always trips people up.
Okay, break it down for us.
A true aneurysm is a thinned, scarred wall that bulges out. It's part of the heart. It rarely ruptures because scar tissue is actually pretty tough.
Yeah.
But because the blood pools and becomes static in that bulge, it loves to form mural thrombi clots that can break off and travel to the brain, causing a stroke.
And a pseudoaneurysm.
That is actually a contained rupture. The muscle wall did break, but the pericardium, that sac around the heart, is holding the blood in like a Band-Aid. It's a hematoma that's communicating with the ventricle.
That sounds incredibly unstable.
It is a ticking time bomb. It has a very high rupture risk. It requires surgery. So one is a weak spot in the tire wall. The other is a hole plugged by the hubcap.
Great analogy. And briefly, pericarditis.
Inflammation of the sac. Early on, in the first few days, you get fibrinous pericarditis just from the necrosis irritating the surface. It's a friction rub you can hear with a stethoscope. But weeks later, you can get Dressler syndrome.
That's autoimmune, right? The body attacking itself.
Yes. The body develops antibodies against the heart antigens that were released during the massive cell death of the attack. It's a delayed systemic inflammatory reaction.
Okay, let's shift gears. We've talked about the heart failing because of plumbing ischemia. Now let's talk about the muscle itself failing. Cardiomyopathies.
And the distinction here is important. These are diseases of the muscle. They aren't secondary to a heart attack or a bad valve. The muscle is the primary problem.
We have three main flavors, plus a weird cousin. Let's start with the most common, dilated cardiomyopathy, DCM.
Think baggy heart.
Flabby, heavy, weak.
All four chambers are dilated. The walls might be thin or thick, but the chambers are huge. Functionally, this is the classic example of systolic failure. The heart is like a stretched-out rubber band that has lost its snap. The ejection fraction is low, usually under 25%.
What causes this? Why does the muscle just give up?
About half the time, it's genetic. Robbins highlights mutations in titin, TTN.
Titin is that giant cytoskeletal protein, right? The spring in the muscle.
The biggest protein in the human body. It acts like a molecular spring that gives the sarcomere its elasticity. If it's defective, the structural integrity of the cell fails. But it can also be toxic alcohol, it's a big one, holiday heart syndrome, or chemotherapy drugs like doxorubicin, or peripartum. The stress of pregnancy can unmask a predisposition.
Okay, flavor number 2, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, HCM.
This is the polar opposite. Think thick heart, muscle-bound, massive hypertrophy, but without any dilation. The walls are incredibly thick.
But specifically the septum, right? It's not a uniform thickening.
Exactly.
Huh.
The key feature is asymmetric septal hypertrophy. The septum bulges into the left ventricle so much it compresses the lumen into a banana shape.
I remember that image from the textbook. It looks claustrophobic. The blood has nowhere to go.
It is. This is a classic diastolic dysfunction. The muscle is so thick and stiff it can't fill properly, but it's also hypercontractile. It squeezes too hard.
And this one is almost entirely genetic.
Pretty much. It's an autosomal dominant trait. It's a disease of the sarcomere, mutations in sarcomere proteins. The beta-myosin heavy chain is the classic one. It's a gain-of-function mutation. The muscle works too hard, it's inefficient, and it hypertrophies in response.
And the histology here is key for diagnosis. If I look under the microscope, what do I see?
Myofiber disarray. It's pathognomonic. Normal heart muscle is like a well-drilled army parallel, organized, synchronized. In HCM, the cells are branching, chaotic, swirling. It's a total mess.
And this is the one we hear about with young athletes.
Sadly, yes. Sudden cardiac death in a young, seemingly healthy person on the basketball court. It's often an arrhythmia caused by this electrical disarray, or it's something called dynamic outflow obstruction.
What is that? That sounds complicated.
As the blood rushes out of the narrowed banana ventricle, the speed creates a suction force. It's the Venturi effect. It sucks the anterior leaflet of the mitral valve into the outflow tract, slamming the door shut while the heart is trying to pump.
So the harder they pump, the more they block the exit.
Exactly. It's a fatal mechanism during high exertion, which is why it presents in athletes.
Okay, third flavor, restrictive cardiomyopathy.
The stiff heart, normal size, usually. The chambers aren't dilated or particularly thick, but the walls are rigid, like stiff leather.
So another diastolic failure. It can't fill.
Yes, impaired ventricular filling. The classic cause here is amyloidosis, misfolded proteins depositing in the wall, turning it into concrete, or radiation fibrosis after cancer treatment, or endomyocardial fibrosis, which you see more in tropical regions. It's less common than the other two, but very difficult to treat.
And there's one more weird one Robbins mentions that I want to touch on, ARVC.
Arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy. This is fascinating and terrifying. The right ventricle wall gets progressively thin and is replaced by fat and fibrosis.
The muscle turns to fat.
It does. It's a disease of the desmosomes, the cellular junctions, the glue holding the cells together. If that glue is defective, as the heart beats, the cells pull apart. The wall essentially unzips and the body repairs the damage with adipose tissue.
And since fat doesn't conduct electricity,
You get massive, life-threatening arrhythmias originating from the right ventricle. And sudden death.
Okay, let's move to section 5. We've talked about the pump. Let's talk about the doors. Valvular heart disease.
Two problems can happen with a door. It won't open or it won't close,
Won't open is stenosis.
which causes pressure overload. The chamber behind the door has to push harder. It hypertrophies,
Won't close is insufficiency or regurgitation.
which causes volume overload. The blood leaks back, so the chamber has to pump the same blood twice. It dilates.
Let's hit the greatest hits of valve disease. Calcific aortic stenosis.
The most common valve lesion in the West. This is essentially wear and tear. It's a disease of aging, superimposed on chronic injury and inflammation, a lot like atherosclerosis.
What does it look like?
You see heaped up, calcified masses within the cusps of the aortic valve. They become rock hard. They can't open fully, so the left ventricle sees a massive pressure load.
So you get that concentric hypertrophy we talked about right at the beginning.
Exactly. The wall thickens to overcome the gradient. It works for years until it doesn't. When symptoms start, the classic triad of angina, syncope, fainting, or heart failure, the survival rate drops off a cliff without surgical valve replacement.
Then there's mitral valve prolapse, MVP.
A completely different pathology. This isn't calcification. This is myxomatous degeneration.
What does that mean in plain English?
It means the connective tissue of the valve gets jelly-like and weak. The valve has layers. The structural layer, the fibrosa, thins out. The middle shock-absorbing layer, the spongiosa, expands with this myxoid material. The leaflets become floppy, oversized, and redundant.
So they balloon back into the atrium.
Yes, they prolapse into the left atrium during the squeeze. If you listen with a stethoscope, you hear a characteristic mid-systolic click as the chordae tendineae snap taut.
Is it dangerous?
Usually it's asymptomatic, but it can predispose to infective endocarditis, significant regurgitation over time, and rarely arrhythmias.
And finally, a big one historically, rheumatic heart disease. This feels like something from a history book, but globally it's still huge.
It is the only significant cause of acquired mitral stenosis, and it's an immune tragedy.
It starts with strep throat.
Group A strep pharyngitis. The bacteria has a protein, the M protein, that looks suspiciously like cardiac antigens. The body makes antibodies to fight the strep, but through molecular mimicry, those antibodies turn around and attack the heart valves, the joints, the brain.
Acute rheumatic fever gives you those Aschoff bodies.
Correct. Aschoff bodies are these distinct foci of inflammation with T cells and those strange Inichgau cells, the caterpillar cells.
Why caterpillar?
Because the chromatin in their nucleus forms a wazy ribbon that looks just like a caterpillar. Mnemonic, you see that, you know it's rheumatic fever.
But the real damage, the chronic damage, is the scarring that comes later.
Years later, the repeated bouts of inflammation heal with fibrosis. The key feature is commissural fusion. The leaflets zip up together at the edges. You get a fish mouth deformity. The valve becomes a rigid, narrow slit. The chordae also thicken and fuse.
It's amazing and horrific how a sore throat at age 10 can end up destroying a mechanical valve at age 40.
It connects immunology to mechanics perfectly. The left atrium behind that stenotic valve sees immense pressure, dilates massively, and often goes into atrial fibrillation.
All right, section 6, arrhythmias. We aren't electrophysiologists, but Robbins makes a good point about connecting structure to rhythm.
Right. We tend to think of arrhythmias as invisible electrical ghosts.
Yeah.
But usually, they are the direct consequences of the structural pathologies we just spent all this time discussing.
Give me an example. How does a scar cause an arrhythmia?
Pick ischemia. When the cell runs out of ATP, the ion pumps, like the sodium-potassium pump, stop working. The electrical potential of the membrane goes haywire. That causes instability. and can lead to ventricular fibrillation.
Okay, and fibrosis. A scar from an old MI.
Scar tissue is an insulator. It doesn't conduct electricity, so if you have a scar, the electrical signal hits a dead end, has to go around it. That creates a reentry circuit. The electricity gets caught spinning in a loop around the scar tissue like a race car on a track. That's ventricular tachycardia.
And dilation.
If you stretch the atrium, say, from the mitral stenosis we just talked about, you physically stretch the conduction pathways. You create areas of slow conduction and fibrosis. That's the perfect substrate for atrial fibrillation. The electrical signals become chaotic.
So structure dictates rhythm. If the road is broken, the car crashes.
In most cases, yes. Unless it's a primary electrical disease, a channelopathy like long QT syndrome or Brugada syndrome, which are pure genetic defects in the ion channels themselves. But pathologically, you always look for the scar, look for the dilation, look for the ischemia.
So we've covered a lot of ground, from the pressure-loaded hypertrophy to the necrotic wavefront of an MI to the floppy valves and the stiff amyloids.
It's a lot of pathology,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not random. There's a logic to it.
If we try to synthesize this, what does it all mean? What is the big picture for someone trying to wrap their head around all this?
I think the biggest takeaway is the concept of integrated failure. We study these things in chapters, ischemia, valvular, myopathic. But in the patient, they are one story. They all connect.
Connect the dots for us. Walk us through a typical downward spiral.
Okay, a patient has a myocardial infarction. That ischemia leads to fibrosis, a scar. The scar doesn't contract, so the rest of the heart dilates to compensate for the lost function. That dilation stretches the mitral valve ring, causing functional mitral regurgitation. The regurgitation adds a volume load, which causes even more dilation. And the stretch and the scar tissue cause ventricular arrhythmias.
It's a domino effect. One failure begets another.
It is a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
It is a failure of synchrony between rhythm, muscle, and supply. When one goes, it pulls the others down with it.
That is a powerful way to frame it. The heart isn't one system, it's three systems that have to work in perfect harmony.
And here's a final provocative thought for you to chew on. Something that Robbins hints at, but doesn't solve.
Lay it on us.
We said the heart doesn't regenerate, it scars, it is terminally differentiated. The cardiomyocytes we have are largely the ones we're stuck with. But Underwood mentions those stem cells. They exist. They just aren't doing enough to make a difference after a big injury.
So the question is, why not?
If we could unlock them, if we could understand why the liver can regrow an entire lobe, but the heart settles for a cheap patch, could we fix the scar? Could we turn a broken heart back into a functional muscular organ? That is the frontier. That is where pathology meets regenerative medicine.
That gives me hope. All right, listener, here is your call to action. We've built the map, but you need to see the territory. Open Robbins chapter 12. Open Underwood chapter 13.
Look at the images. You need to see the wavy fibers. You need to see the myofiber disarray and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. You need to see the Ashos bodies. You need to see the chaos to understand the disease.
The podcast is the scaffold. The reading is the building. Go fill it in. Thanks for diving deep with us.
Until next time.